The Gospel of Mark. Welcome. Welcome back to part 2 of our study of the Gospel of Mark. We come to you from the First Christian Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. This is a expanded version of our community Bible study. For many years now, we've had a Bible study on Tuesday mornings at the church. We can no longer do that, so we're offering our Bible study online to our community. In part 1, we looked at Mark and talked a little bit about what we know about Mark, and we also looked at the readers and listeners of the Gospel of Mark and its original destination and formulation. Today we're doing an overview of a study of Mark, of the Gospel of Mark. We will begin by studying briefly the text of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is written in many manuscripts and parts of manuscripts and other sources in the ancient world. There are some 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Many of them are vast and large and include most of the gospel, most of the writings of the New Testament. Others are fairly small. One of the smallest manuscripts is a portion of the Gospel of John, which is about so large. Portions of the Gospel of John are written on both sides of this parchment, and it dates to 135 or 140, which is a sort of median date. Some dated a little early, some a little later. But we have many manuscripts of Mark and portions of Mark in the ancient Greek language. We also have very early translations of Mark from Greek to other languages, particularly Syriac, but other languages are also represented. There are quotations from the early fathers of the church, first century writers like Ignatius and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and others in the second century will quote from Mark, so we have those quotations to utilize as well. There are a number of what scholars call textual variants in the Gospel of Mark. A textual variant is when one manuscript says A and another manuscript says B in the same place. How do we reconcile that? Or do we? In many cases, it's not a big deal. In some cases, we can see where a scribe looked at a word up here and wrote it down, saw the same word down here, and continued from down here and left out that block of material in the middle. So some of these variants are not controversial, but some of them are. Many of them are controversial because they have significant implications for the text. Mark has only a couple of really significant theological textual variants. We'll look at one of these beginning with verse 1 in first chapter of Mark. Here we see the words, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and some manuscripts have the Son of God, others lack that. If your translation is a modern translation and it has Jesus Christ, the Son of God, there'll be some sort of marker to indicate that other ancient authorities lack that. If your translation lacks that phrase, there'll be a footnote marker there to indicate that other manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, include that. But the most significant textual variant in the Gospel of Mark concerns its ending. The ending of Mark is a big problem. The problem basically is that many ancient manuscripts in the text of Mark at 16:8. 16:8 is the sort of conclusion of the women at the tomb. The women go to the tomb on Easter morning, and there they find the tomb empty, and they're directed by what we think is an angel, a young man in brilliant clothing, tells them to go and tell. And the text ends just saying the women were afraid and they didn't tell anybody. So 16:8 raises a lot of questions. Why would Mark end the gospel there? And in the last 200 or so years, scholars have put forth a number of explanations for why some manuscripts end here and others continue the manuscript. Some argue that the ending of Mark has been lost. Rats ate it. Somebody tore it off and used the end for fire starters. We don't know, but that's an explanation put forward by some. Others argue that Mark didn't finish the gospel. He got to this point and perhaps the Roman authorities came and arrested him. Perhaps, he dropped dead from a heart attack. Perhaps his kid wanted him to go out and play ball with him. We don't know. But this argument says Mark never really finished the gospel. Well, we talked about the arguments around 16:8, but we have two other endings which are sometimes given to us. One is called the longer ending and the other is called the shorter ending. The longer ending has a number of variations on it as well. But most of these variations on the longer ending are rejected. There's one from a manuscript in Russia that dates to the 13th, 14th century, and that's too late to really get the eye of biblical scholars who tend to believe that the earlier the gospel, the more likely it is to be correct. Well, the longer ending has a lot of commonalities with the endings in Matthew and especially Luke, but a lot of scholars say that some scribe early on tried to what they call harmonize the ending with Matthew and Luke so that the three Gospels would be more alike in their endings. Well, in our study, we're going to assume that Mark had a reason for ending the Gospel at 16:8, and that will impact some in our study of major themes in the work. After all, most authors usually have some sort of destination or end or result point that they want to move the story toward. And this story then perhaps moves toward the fear factor of the women who are afraid to tell the story of the empty tomb. Now, Mark uses a number of very important literary devices. Back in the early 19th century, biblical scholars thought Mark was pretty straightforward, often argued that it was the most historically accurate of the New Testament Gospels because it wasn't highly theological, whereas Matthew and Luke and John all have important theological themes. It was argued that Mark didn't. This was upset around the year 1900 when folks began to see the theological significance and viewpoints of Mark more clearly. And one of the ways we see these is through these literary devices that Mark uses. One of these devices is the use of doublets. A doublet is a similar story told twice, but it's only similar, it's not identical, and we look at the differences to see what's really important about those doublets, what's really important that Mark is trying to emphasize to us. Well, there are a number of doublets. Let me give you two examples. In the Gospel of Mark, there are two feeding miracles, a doublet, very much alike. Jesus takes a little bit of food and feeds an enormous number of people. Similarities between both those feedings. But there are also significant differences. One feeding occurs among a largely Jewish audience, the other among a Gentile audience. So what Jesus does in multiplying bread for Jews, he does for Gentiles as well. And in case folks have a hard time grasping that, the 5,000 ate and they had 12 baskets of bread left over. The 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples. It delineates the inclusion of all the Jewish community here. On the other hand, when Jesus fed the 4,000, those among the Gentiles, the disciples went through, and why they'd want to do this, I don't know, but they went around and collected all the leftover bread and had 7 baskets full. 7 is a number which represents the entirety of creation. Jesus cares for Jews and Gentiles. He cares for all the people of the world and provides bread for them. And as we'll see later on in Mark, Jesus gives his life like bread. His life is broken like the bread for us and for our salvation. Well, the stories, the miracles of the feeding of the multitudes, 2 of them, very important that you note that they are distinguished by the differences in the audience. Another doublet is the story of the healing of 2 blind men. 2 blind men, 2 men who can't see, 2 men who are granted recovery of sight. Very similar, but the method by which the 2 blind men are healed is very different. You have the blind man at Bethsaida. He can't see, and Jesus decides to heal him, and Jesus touches him, and the man says, "Oh, I can see something now, but everything's vague. I see people, but they're like trees." He has partial vision, but his vision is not fully restored. And Jesus has to touch him a second time. And with the second touch, the man is able to see clearly. Matthew and Luke don't include this story. Neither does John. We kind of think that perhaps Matthew and Luke didn't catch on what was going on here and thought Jesus looked weak because it took him 2 times to touch this man so that he could see. Later in the book, we get the story of the blind Bartimaeus. This story is also told in Matthew and Luke. And in Mark, blind Bartimaeus just asked Jesus to heal him, and Jesus apparently heals him without touching him. And so Bartimaeus gets his sight back right away. What's particularly interesting, not just the 2 differences in this doublet, but the fact that in this section between these 2 healings, you have the disciples who continually only get part of it. For example, it's in this passage, in between these 2 healings, that Peter answers the big question. When Jesus asks, who do you say I am? Peter says, "You are the Christ," and nails it. And then Jesus goes on to say, "I'm going to die." And Peter takes him aside and says, "No way, Jesus, no way you're going to die." See, Peter understood Jesus was the Messiah. He had partial sight, partial insight into who Jesus was, but he didn't fully understand who Jesus was. And so this passage goes on to explain and give examples of the disciples learning more about what it means to be a disciple, what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Doublets. There are a number of these. There are some others, and I've identified those in the reading guide for you. Another literary device is called an intercalation. An intercalation is a fancy word. Some don't use it. Some call them sandwiches. And that's sort of an illustration for what an intercalation is. An intercalation is a story that's broken into 2 parts, and another story, a second story, is inserted in between, intercalated in between the story. So you have one story divided and a second story introduced in between. So why do something like this? It gives us greater insight into both stories. Perhaps the best illustration of an intercalation is the story of Jairus' daughter. That's story number 1. It starts and finishes, and in between there's the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. You have Jairus' people go to Jesus and say, hey, we've got a sick girl, sick daughter, and she needs your help. Please come help us. As Jesus is moving and the crowd's moving with him and enclosed all around him, a woman reaches out. And you have the story of the woman with the hemorrhage who reaches out and grabs Jesus' robe and touches it and is healed. And then Jesus, after talking with her, finishes the story, goes to Jairus' house and raises the daughter. Now, there are many interesting similarities here. One is that both of these healings involve a daughter. You have Jairus' daughter, and you have this woman that Jesus identifies as a daughter. And so they have that much in common. But the woman with the hemorrhage has been suffering for 12 long, miserable years. She's been an outcast. She's not been able to participate in polite company openly. In fact, that she was in the midst of this crowd was contrary to Jewish customs and teachings at the time. This little girl, Jairus' daughter, was 12 years old. She had been living her life for 12 years and evidently has just come down with this whatever disease, condition it was. And she is also moving toward death. Both these daughters then are in bad trouble. Touch was important in each of these. The woman with the hemorrhage was able to reach out and initiate a touch. Jairus' daughter, who was presumed dead by the time Jesus got there, received a touch from Jesus. So you can touch Jesus and be healed, or Jesus can touch you and be healed. Faith was important in each healing. The woman's faith had made her well, Jesus told her. She had the faith. Jairus' daughter, on the other hand, was dead. And whether she had faith or not, it was the faith of her family that provided the faith that was necessary for her to be restored to life. And lastly, we have people who come from very different walks of life. The woman with the hemorrhage was an outcast. Her bleeding kept her on the fringes of society. She was broke financially. There's no mention of any kinfolk or friends. She was probably pretty much lonely and sick, and life was oozing out of her life every day. On the other hand, you have Jairus' daughter. Jairus was presumably a person of some economic and social importance in the community. That's how you got to be a leader in the synagogue. He had to have some connections and some importance. So she comes from a very different, what we would call social economic status group than this woman. So by including these stories together, we can see that the ministry of Jesus is for all people, not just people like Jairus and his daughter, but also like this woman, unnamed, who is continually bleeding. There are a couple other I can't say it now, sorry. Sandwiches, incollations, whatever, in the book, and those were noted in the reading guide. Sets of three is a very widespread literary device. You might remember from your childhood, or your children's childhood, or your grandchildren's childhood, that, we have the story of the three bears, and the story of the three pigs, and we can go on. Threes are a very common utilization in literary stories cross-culturally. There are many of these in the Gospel of Mark. To enumerate just some of them, there are three call experiences. The call experiences are when Jesus calls various disciples to come to him and follow him. There are three passion predictions. The passion predictions are when Jesus says, hey gang, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. The passion here is referring to the death of Jesus. Jesus and his followers are condemned 3 times for violations of the Sabbath by the scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus is revealed as the Son of God in 3 different pivotal events in Jesus' life. At his baptism, at the Mount of Transfiguration, and at the cross. In the first 2 of these, God reveals that Jesus is the Son of God. At the cross, the man who's in charge of crucifying Jesus reveals that Jesus is the Son of God. There are 3 important disciples, Peter, James, and John. There are 3 times where the question of who Jesus is comes to the fore. Early on, first of all, you have the audiences, the people asking who Jesus is. Then later, the disciples ask themselves who Jesus is. And finally, Jesus asks his own disciples who he is. And you have Peter's response. So sets of 3 are noted throughout the reading guide. There's the rapid opening. Getting on into the Gospel of Mark is like stepping onto a moving treadmill. You got to get going. In the other Gospels, there's a little interlude of sorts before you get to the Jesus ministry itself. In Matthew, you have the genealogy and then the infancy narrative. In Luke, you have the infancy narrative, then the genealogy. In the Gospel of John, you have the prologue, that beautiful Christ hymn that begins that gospel. But in Mark, you get going right away. It's more vivid, I'm told, by those who really know Greek well, that there's just a lot of movement moving forward. And you have the use of the word immediately quite often. So there's no time for a lot of reflection or much discussion of it, but go to it. And then what scholars refer to as the sudden ending. That's the ending at 16:8. Since things are geared toward the ending, what are the things that might gear toward that ending where the women are afraid? Well, this points to, for many scholars, but not for all, what's referred to as the Messianic secret. Messianic secret is, a title given to the question, why does Jesus tell so many people to keep his identity secret? Don't tell anybody. I healed you, yeah, but don't go out and tell everybody that. That's the Messianic secret. In your pamphlet, I've identified several of these events, but I want to focus not on those events themselves, but on the answers that are given by individuals. One answer is that Jesus did not understand his own mission until after the resurrection. So Jesus wasn't sure about what was going to happen until after God proved it to Jesus in the resurrection. Another perspective, the disciples did not understand Jesus' mission as that of the Messiah until after the resurrection. So in this case, Jesus would understand his ministry as that of the Messiah, but the disciples didn't really understand it until the resurrection. A third option is that the concept of Messiah was too vague and too easily misunderstood to be useful in Jesus' lifetime. His life then would define what the Messiah would be like. Another perspective, political authorities would have hampered anyone claiming to be the Messiah. That's perhaps is an understatement, because we know that the authorities killed a number of individuals and their disciples who claimed to be Messiah. Lastly, the Messianic secret is a literary device used by Mark to reveal the true nature of Jesus. This is the approach that we'll be using as we work through the gospel. The Messianic secret is a literary device to help us understand who Jesus really was. If we're to understand who Jesus really was, Mark has to reveal who Jesus is, and he does so in a number of different ways. He begins by arguing, perhaps in Mark 1:1, that Jesus is the Son of God. But at three significant points in Jesus' life, we have this revelation pronounced. At Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven comes, and apparently, we're not absolutely sure, but apparently Jesus is the only one that hears that voice. That Jesus hears this affirmation from God of who Jesus is. Later, about halfway through the book, we get the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, where he's on the mountaintop and meets with Moses and Elijah, and they're all radiant, and the three disciples, at least the three disciples, maybe the other disciples, but at least the three who were up there, James and John and Peter, heard the voice, the revelation from God that Jesus is the Son of God. And then lastly, and perhaps in many ways the most significant of the three revelations that Jesus is the Son of God, occurs at the cross, where the centurion in charge of executing Jesus proclaims to all those who are at the foot of the cross, probably meant to be literally as well as figuratively at the foot of the cross, proclaims Jesus as the Son of God. The first time an earthly individual has identified Jesus as the Son of God comes from his executioner and is pronounced to all those around. So we see here an increasing awareness of Jesus as the Son of God. First to Jesus, and then to at least 3 of the disciples, and then to the faith community at the foot of the cross. Then in Mark you have the question, who is Jesus? The crowds ask one another, who is this that's teaching with authority? And we really hadn't gotten any of Jesus' teachings at this point. But they're asking the question, who is this teaching with this authority? Later, you have the disciples and Jesus in a boat. Jesus is sawing logs, and the storm comes up, and the disciples are terrified. They wake Jesus up. Jesus calms, stills, silences the sea, and goes back to sleep, evidently. And the disciples ask among themselves, who is this that can silence the wind and the waves? And then in the most famous of these questions, Jesus himself asks the disciples, who do people say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am? Another means that Mark uses, another literary device that Mark uses to explain who Jesus is the 3 passion predictions. And the first one, Jesus explains he's going to die, and Peter says, no way. And then Jesus explains why that's necessary. So the passion predictions are built around 3 different blocks of material. You have Jesus predicting the impending death, his impending death. Then you have one or more of the disciples raising questions about what's going to happen. They don't know what's going to happen. And then last, Jesus using that as a teaching opportunity. And each of these events reveals more and more information about the Messiah and how Jesus will perform as Messiah. There are a few materials that are unique to Mark. These are identified in your book, the pamphlet. Perhaps the most unsettling of these is the first of these listed. Jesus is beside himself. This refers to a passage where Jesus' family is coming to get them because they fear he has mental issues, that they has some sort of problem that they want to help him with and dealing with because he's probably embarrassing the family. And so this kind of family rejection of Jesus is not included in Matthew or Luke, but Mark has it, and we'll look at it in detail later on. Well, we've looked at some of the statements and ideas and concepts and literary tools that Mark uses to help him to help us understand who Jesus is and what the text means and so forth in the larger frames of references. next week we'll begin our study of the gospel text, beginning with Mark 1:1. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.